All right, it looks like we're live. Randy, thanks for coming on again. Appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. And thank you for inviting me back. My name is Randy Grasso. I live in Dallas, Texas. By profession, I am a lawyer, but by avocation, I am a Catholic lay evangelist. I was, I guess, always raised in the church in Protestant Christianity, and I became a Catholic in 2006. Um, and so this brings us to where we are today.
Awesome. So we're going to talk about the resurrection, and you said you wanted to give an introduction.
Yeah, sure. Since I think I bear the burden of proof on this, and you're the gracious host, and I appreciate you having me on to talk about this. I do want to sort of set the table, if I might, so we can have a little bit of context about what we're going to be talking about. So my thesis is briefly this, that Jesus, a man who claimed to be the Son of God and the Savior of the world, rose from the dead. This is a fact that can be proved with at least as much certainty as any universally believed and well-documented event in ancient history, and without presupposing that miracles happen or that they don't happen, or that the New Testament is infallible, divinely inspired, or even true. We don't need to presuppose that there was really an empty tomb or post-resurrection appearances as recorded. We need only to presuppose the existence of the New Testament documents as we have them, and the existence of the Christian religion as we have it today. Finally, if the resurrection is true, what then? And for my remarks today, I have to give credit where credit is due, and that is to a marvelous book written by Dr. Peter Kreeft and also by Ronald J. Tiselli called Handbook of Catholic Apologetics. Dr. Kreeft has been he's been a philosopher and professor at Boston College since 1965, and he writes and speaks on these topics and has written probably 50 books. And he's a very popular lecturer at Boston College on the topic of philosophy and also Christian apologetics. So hat tip to Dr. Kreeft.
Okay, so my position is that the methodology in history does not allow to give support for anything that doesn't already have an empirical basis. So like similar to a courtroom, if somebody said they saw a leprechaun kill somebody or a unicorn kill somebody, that wouldn't be taken seriously in a courtroom. You couldn't provide evidence just based off eyewitness testimony for that. Same in history. No historical accounts of anything that doesn't have an empirical basis. So miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, none of those are able to be supported through historical documents because those are prevalent in historical documents. There's lots of different cases of miracles. We don't take any of them seriously, no matter how well attested the document may be, because history is not able to assess new kinds of ontologies in a reality. It's only allowed to assess things that we already know exist and how they could have happened in the past. There's a really long quote from a historian in a paper by Mike Licona, who's a Christian historian. He's arguing for miracles, but it shows that the consensus in history right now is that no amount of historical testimony can ever validate any kind of miraculous claims. And I think that is a good methodology to take. It seems like the fact that it was written down in a book by very superstitious people thousands of years ago doesn't allow for a justified belief that any kind of miracle occurred. It's far more likely that they had an experience they couldn't explain and then attributed that to being a miracle. And so it seems unlikely to me that the resurrection story in the New Testament actually happened. It's far more likely that it was a kind of a bereavement delusion that the people who follow Jesus had. And that seems like a much more plausible explanation than Jesus actually rising from the dead.
Very good. Well, thank you for that. And so I do think it's best to set the table because many of your watchers, your fan base may not be familiar with the actual accounts of the resurrection from the New Testament documents. And so with your permission, I'd like to sort of go through what those accounts are so we can discuss them. And we could then discuss the various theories on miracles, if that's appropriate, about whether miracles are possible and whether miracles have actually happened. And then we can also discuss the basis for the accounts in the New Testament documents, since there are basically 5 possibilities that account for the writings of the New Testament. We can go through those quickly.
Sure.
And my time is not limited to today as it was last time, so I have a little bit more time to engage in this great conversation with you. And I especially thank you for letting us talk about this topic on this week of all weeks. This is Holy Week. This is the week that leads up to the passion, death, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so nothing could be timelier than what we're talking about today. So I really appreciate that. So if you don't mind, I want to take a few minutes and go through the New Testament documents for the resurrection, because this will form the basis of my defense and your criticisms of these various accounts. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start with a brief excerpt from the Gospel of Luke from chapter 1, and then go into his account for the significant event of the crucifixion and then the resurrection. And so I'm reading from chapter 1 of the Gospel of St. Luke, the first 4 verses. Many have been at pains to set forth the history of what time has brought to fulfillment among us, following the tradition of those first eyewitnesses who gave themselves up to the service of the word. And I too, most noble Theophilus, have resolved to put the story in writing for thee as it befell, having first traced it carefully from its beginnings, that thou mayest understand the instruction thou hast already received in all its certainty. So Luke there sets the table by claiming that he looked into this and then also tried to set this down in due order. We also remember that Luke was not a disciple. He was not an eyewitness to these events. He was a physician and an early historian of these events. And we know that he was writing about these events because he wrote the book of Acts. And he wrote these things, especially about the start of the early church, the conversion of St. Paul, which I'm going to touch upon, and these various events, which all occurred before the year 70, before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So this is an early account by an early historian. So turning to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23, it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. The sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was torn in its midst. And Jesus said, crying with a loud voice, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit, and yielded up his spirit as he said it. And the centurion, when he saw the issue, gave glory to God. This, he said, was indeed a just man. And the whole multitude of those who stood there watching it, when they saw what befell, went home beating their breasts. All his acquaintances with the women who had followed him from Galilee watched while this happened, standing at a distance. And now a man called Joseph came forward, one of the counselors, a good and upright man, who had not taken part with the council and its doings. He was from Arimathea, a Jewish city, and was one of those who waited for the kingdom of God. He it was who approached Pilate and asked to have the body of Jesus. Then he took and wrapped it in a winding sheet and laid it in a tomb fashioned out of the rock in which no man had ever been buried. It was the day of preparation. The next day was the Sabbath. And the women who came with him from Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how his body was buried. So they went back and prepared spices and ointments. And while it was the Sabbath, they kept still as the law commanded. And at very early dawn on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb, bringing the spices they had prepared, and found the stone already rolled away from the door of the tomb. They went into it and could not find the body of the Lord Jesus. They were still puzzling over this when 2 men came and stood by them in shining garments. These said to him, as they bowed their faces to the earth in fear, Why are you seeking one who is alive here among the dead? He is not here. He has risen again. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee. The Son of Man is to be given up into the hands of sinners, and to be crucified, and to rise again the 3rd day. Then they remembered what he had said and returned from the tomb, bringing news of all this to the 11 apostles and to all the rest. It was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, who told the apostles this. But their minds, but to their minds, the story seemed madness, and they could not believe it. Only Peter rose up and ran to the tomb where he looked in and saw the grave clothes lying by themselves, and went away full of surmise over what had befallen. It was on the same day that two of them were walking to a village called Emmaus, 60 furlongs away from Jerusalem, discussing all that had happened. They were still conversing and debating together when Jesus himself drew near and began to walk beside them. But their eyes were held fast, so they could not recognize him. And he said to them, "What talk is this you exchange between yourselves as you go along sad faced?" And one of them, who was called Cleophas, answered him, "What? Art thou the only pilgrim in Jerusalem who has not heard of what happened there in the last few days?" "What happenings?" he asked. And they said, "About Jesus of Nazareth, a prophet whose words and acts had power with God and with all the people. How the chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death and so crucified him. For ourselves, we had hoped that it was he who was to deliver Israel. But now, to crown it all, today is the third day since it befell. Some women indeed who belonged to our community alarmed us, and they had been at the tomb early in the morning, and they could not find his body. Whereupon they came back and told us they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of these who were with us went to the tomb and found that it was all as the women had said, but of him they saw nothing. Then he said to them, "Too slow of wit, too dull of heart to believe all these sayings of the prophets. Was it not to be expected that the Christ should undergo these sufferings and enter into his glory?" Then going back to Moses and the whole line of the prophets, he began to interpret the words used of himself by all the scriptures. And now they were drawing near to the village to which they were walking, and he made of it to go on further. But they pressed him. "Stay with us," they said. "It is toward evening, and it is far on in the day." So he went in to stay with them. And then when he sat down at table with them, he took bread and blessed it and broke it and offered it to them. Whereupon their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and with that he disappeared from their sight. And they said to one another, "Were not our hearts burning within us when he spoke to us on the road and when he made the scriptures plain to us?" Rising up there and then, they went back to Jerusalem, where they found the 11 apostles and their companions gathered together, now saying, "The Lord has indeed risen and has appeared to Simon." And they too told the story of their encounter on the road and how they recognized him when he broke the bread. While they were speaking of this, he himself stood in the midst of them and said, "Peace be with you. It is myself. Do not be afraid." They cowered down full of terror, thinking they were seeing an apparition. "What?" he said to them. "Are you dismayed? Whence come these surmises in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet, to be assured that it is I myself. Touch me and look. A spirit has not flesh and bones, as you see I have." And as he spoke thus, he showed them his hands and his feet. Then, while they were still doubtful and bewildered with joy, he asked them, "Have you anything here to eat?" So they put before them a piece of roast fish and a honeycomb. And he took these and ate in their presence. "This is what I told you," he said, "while I was still walked with your company, how all this was written of me in the law of Moses and in the prophets and in the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he enlightened their minds to make them understand the scriptures. "So it was written," he told them, "and so it was fitting that the Christ should suffer and should rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name to all the nations, beginning in Jerusalem. Of this you are witnesses. And behold, I am sending down upon you the gift which was promised by my Father. You must wait in the city until you are clothed with power from on high." When he had led them out as far as Bethany, he lifted up his hands and blessed them. And even as he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried into heaven. So they bowed down to worship him and went back full of joy to Jerusalem, where they spent their time continually in the temple, praising and blessing God. So that's from the Gospel of Luke. And I appreciate your patience with me. If you don't mind, I'd like to read from Matthew. Is that okay with you, or do you want to go on?
Well, the first thing would be, what is the goal of reading it? Because to me, it seems like I don't see how this provides evidence. It's like if I started reading from Harry Potter, that wouldn't be evidence of Harry Potter. So from me, there are lots of problems with the gospel accounts. Like there are many contradictions. Bart Ehrman just did a great debate with Jimmy Atkin, where he went through many of the different contradictions and showed that they're not really reliable on what happened there. But even if they were, it still wouldn't count as evidence. So I'm not sure, how does this provide evidence that it actually occurred?
Very good. Well, then that gets to the question of what do we do with these New Testament documents? The New Testament documents certainly exist. They, the scholars, even liberal scholars, date the existence of the Gospels to the period in the first generation, right after Jesus' death and resurrection. The earliest writing in the New Testament was probably around 60 AD. The last writing was probably around 110 AD. And so all of these documents were written by people who were either witnesses or had interviewed witnesses, and they are slightly different in many accounts, but they're remarkably similar. There's no evidence here to say that they are all coordinated or they're all written at the same time. They're written with different emphases by different authors. Matthew was a disciple, so was John. Luke was a physician who went about afterwards, and he was a traveler with St. Paul, we know from the book of Acts. And we also know that Mark was a disciple of Peter and told in his gospel, his source was the apostle St. Peter. And so the question then is, what do we do with these documents? These documents do not appear to be myth. They don't appear to be fanciful. They don't appear to be similar to other mythic language of other documents of that same period. There's no evidence here of fairy tales. There's no evidence of people acting abnormally. You bind up the whole story of the life of Jesus with his miraculous life. You really can't separate them. And therefore, the accounts that are given appear to be organic, integrated, ordinary, and they're just telling an extraordinary story. So I believe that a case can be made for the fact that these documents have as much credibility and are as worthy of respect as any other document written by about any other famous person from about that time period. And therefore, I think that if one reads the Gospels without some presupposition that they must be myth, you can say, well, the story that's told of Jesus, of his life, of his encounters, of his weaknesses, of the apostles' failings, of their strengths, of his miracles, of his teaching, are all an integrated whole. And therefore, when we get to the story of his crucifixion, which is a fact in history, and we get to the fact of his resurrection, we have to say, these seem credible. These seem credible. And when you go through these various accounts and try to understand the explanation of what we read in the Gospels, we have to conclude various theories about the historicity of the resurrection. So I believe that without going through then the other documents, we need to talk about what is the evidence of the historical writings, and no one denies these historical writings exist. The question is what weight should be given to them.
Yeah, that would be true. So in my case, we could just take these all as, suppose Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, we all met them today in a courtroom and they presented this case. Would the case rule that Jesus rose from the dead? No, they just throw it out. It doesn't matter if these were literally eyewitnesses. We can just forget the fact that they were written 50, 60, 70 years later. That doesn't matter. We can forget the fact that some of the inconsistencies in the story don't make sense. Luke and Paul probably didn't know each other. There are contradictions. None of that matters to me. To me, it just seems like we could take these to be literal cases of 4 or 5 guys walking up today into a courtroom giving eyewitness testimony, and it still wouldn't be taken seriously because this happens all the time. This is exactly like UFO testimony. They have the same kinds of credibility. People who see UFOs aren't crazy people. They present their case and they genuinely did see something, and they genuinely do share certain qualities, and they can make the case that they saw something, but no one's going to conclude they saw aliens. other than them. They're making that claim they saw aliens, but everyone else could say, okay, they saw something they didn't understand and they concluded it was aliens, and we'd probably make the same case here for Jesus. So to me, none of the actual accounts here make a difference, because it seems exactly the same as all the other accounts of Bigfoot, Loch Ness monster, aliens, the all the different kinds of creatures, leprechauns. There are legitimate testimonies of leprechauns. There's actually a disease that we know of where people see miniature people, and so they can genuinely account and see miniature people, and they are actually seeing it, and they thought it was a leprechaun, but really it's just a neurological disorder. So
No.
I don't see why any of this would count as evidence for Jesus actually resurrecting, as it just being a story like all of the other stories.
All right. Well, there are only but this is a story. You have to take the documents as they exist. The documents as they exist tell a story. The question is, are you going to dismiss it because they say something unusual, or are you going to say, well, no, this is a fact. There are facts related here, and we have to judge the credibility of it. So there are only really 5 explanations for the accounts of the resurrection. The first explanation, there are only 2. If we look at logical exclusion, either Jesus died or Jesus did not die. Correct? I mean, those 2 are mutually exclusive. Jesus died, Jesus did not die. So now let's assume that if Jesus did not die, then what accounts for the empty tomb? Most scholars would say there is a theory called the swoon theory, that Jesus never died and that he just escaped from the tomb. We can go into that if you think that's a viable theory.
Well, I think the consensus in history is there wasn't an empty tomb right now. That was one of the ones that Gary Habermas presented as his minimal facts, and he actually later recanted and said, actually, no, this one doesn't count because it's not really widely accepted among historians that there was an empty tomb. So some of the major problems with the empty tomb is that Romans didn't give tombs. Just the whole point of crucifixion was to leave the body up there as an embarrassment, to show that you're not supposed to go against the state. They wouldn't have cut the body off, especially not like 3 days later, and they wouldn't have given it to the family. They would have left it there and they would have put it in a mass grave. That's a far more plausible explanation. But
the historical documents point to something else. The historical documents say that Jesus' body was taken down, that the Romans made sure he was dead. They didn't break his legs. They pierced him with a sword, a spear, to make sure he was dead. He was not left on the tomb, on the cross, which is ordinarily done to Roman criminals. That Jesus was taken down from the cross and he was put in a tomb, and that the Jews were worried that the disciples might steal the body of Jesus because he'd said that he was going to rise from the dead. And so he was put in a tomb, and the Jews, in concert with Pontius Pilate, appointed a guard to stand guard over the tomb to make sure that Jesus stayed in the tomb. Now then,
well, the problem is that all seems like it's completely fabricated. Like all of that seems fake. Like the Romans would never do that. Why would they put a stone in front of it? That makes absolutely no sense. They wouldn't have put guards there. They wouldn't have let the body down. Like absolutely none of that makes any historical sense. That's like saying that the emperor came down and bowed to a crane or something, and then just gave all his money. Like it just didn't happen. Like many of the stories in the Bible are completely fabricated. Moses didn't exist. There was no Exodus. All of the archaeological evidence points against that. So the best explanation there is that none of that happened, because that's completely against everything that has ever happened in all of Rome ever.
Interesting. Well, so you're basically then saying whatever the gospel record says, which has been believed and criticized for 2,000 years, you're saying the gospel records are all fabricated. None of this happened. Jesus died on the cross. Jesus's body remained on the cross, and he was thrown into a common grave.
Yes, there's lots of things that did happen. So yeah, he was definitely killed, and I think he did exist. He was crucified. He was a Christian leader or Jewish leader. So yeah, I think many of the things are true in the Gospels, but definitely not all of them. And we can show that because they contradict in many cases.
All right. So my thesis is that the Gospel records give an accurate account of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, that he was in fact put into a tomb, and that and so you say, I'm trying to understand your point. Your point is that Jesus was never buried. Is that
He,
is that what
he
you're
was
saying?
buried, but not in a tomb. He was mass grave.
So where was Jesus buried?
I don't know if
All
they
right.
we they don't record where they put mass graves. That's the thing Romans did
Now
not do.
let's account for some other facts. Because one of the facts is the existence of the New Testament documents. The other fact is the existence of Christianity. So if as I'm sure you've read the book of Acts, and you've heard about the story of St. Paul. You know who St. Paul was, correct?
Yep,
Saul of
Paul,
Tarsus became St.
the guy who tortured the Christians, then converted on the road to seeing Jesus. Something.
Correct. So, yes, Paul was Paul who wrote many of the books of the New Testament and letters to various churches, and whose conversion and life with the early church is recounted in the book of Acts. Paul was a persecutor of Christians, and he was under orders from the Pharisees to arrest Christians. And he had stood by to see the murder of a Christian, Saint Stephen, and basically was giving consent to the murder of Saint Stephen by stoning. And Paul, with letters from the Jews, was going to Damascus to persecute Christians that were there, and he had a remarkable experience of a conversion. The conversion of Saint Paul is one of the most well-known conversion stories in the history of the world. Saint Augustine is another one, but Paul met the risen Christ, was blinded for 3 days, and was told that he would he'd have to suffer much. For the mission that Jesus had for him, and that he later was blinded for 3 days until scales fell from his eyes, and he was converted and went about immediately preaching the resurrection of Jesus, whom he had immediately just before been persecuting. And in fact, the conversion of St. Paul, is a great story to help prove the resurrection of Christ, that Christ, in fact, had died and rose again, and appeared to an enemy of his, Saul of Tarsus, who was persuaded then that Jesus was alive, and thereafter he preached the resurrection. And the thing
Well,
about it,
how is that evidence? Because to me, it seems like there are lots of those kinds of stories where people convert, especially after being greatly hateful or vitriolic towards a certain ideology. They're guilt ridden, and then when they're guilt ridden, they have bereavement delusions of the God or the people they killed, and then they convert. That's pretty common. Nazis experience that. People who tortured the Chinese and Japanese experience that. It doesn't seem to be very particularly hard. It's a pretty common feature in humanity that people have bereavement delusions after being guilt ridden.
I don't think that Saul of Tarsus, a persecutor of the church, had guilt delusions and was in bereavement. He was a full-throated persecutor of the church, and was going about arresting Christians. He had no intention whatsoever of bereaving the death of Jesus, whom he thought was a false Messiah, and this was a Jewish cult that needed to be put down.
Well, that's the same with all the cases I'm mentioning. They all started off hating some ideology. Like it's common in the LGBT community, people who hate gay people, but then they become gay because they're just repressing their own certain kinds of emotions. Like if the more you hate a group, the more powerful emotions you feel towards the group, the more likely you are to experience kinds of bereavement delusions and shifts. If you just don't care, those are the ones who are least likely to have these kinds of things. So the fact that he was so passionately hateful is more evidence that it was just like all of the other cases we've seen of this, where it was just a bereavement delusion. It wouldn't be evidence against it, it'd be evidence for it. If he just didn't care and he was just doing his job or whatever, then he probably wouldn't have a bereavement delusion.
Well, your take on St. Paul is different than history's, and certainly is different than the New Testament. But we still have to deal with the issue of what happened to Jesus. I believe you stated earlier that one of your contentions was that there was no empty tomb.
Yeah, the evidence supported by the majority of academic historians says that is not a plausible thing to believe happened. Like the way you assess the accuracy of a historical document isn't you trust the things that are trustworthy, and then also the rest. You like say, oh, is this consistent with the time period? Is this consistent with the facts, or does it contradict? And if it contradicts, it's probably false. So that these many of the facts, like the tomb and the guards on the tomb and the stone on the tomb, all seem highly unlikely, completely contradictory to everything Romans ever did. This is not something that Romans would ever do under any circumstances. This wasn't even a special case. Romans were just like, meh, like, who is this guy? We don't really care. It's the Jews are the ones who want to persecute him, not us. So they wouldn't do anything special here. They don't care. So
But well,
it seems completely implausible to think there was actually a tomb with the stone and guards.
Well, of course, the reason the Romans put him to death was at the urging of the Jews. And the Jews saw Jesus as a threat to their their control. They saw him as a leader that the people were going to be following. And they, in fact, reasoned among themselves that if we don't do something about this man, the whole world will follow him. And so they contrived to put him to death and to incorporate the Roman authorities, Pontius Pilate, in their scheme.
Well,
And
right, but the
so,
question here is why would the Romans diverge from the same thing because they did thousands of crucifixions every year. None of them got a tomb. They leave them up for weeks at a time until the body decays publicly, and then they put it in a mass grave. That's what they always do. I don't think there are like any exceptions here. Why would they give an entire tomb, which is worth a lot of money back then, with a giant stone, and then put centurions, because they wouldn't care if you stole the body. They literally wouldn't care at all. So it doesn't make any sense why they take it down early. That makes no sense. Why they put it in a tomb, which makes no sense. Why they put guards there and a stone over it, because rolling a stone over a tomb is really not common practice ever. Like, why did the Romans break all of their historical tradition and training and everything they normally do for this guy who was not in any way special to the Romans?
it was at the urging of the Jews because they were not going to let someone remain on the cross over the Sabbath. They wanted to have all this taken care of. They were, and in fact, the Romans were out to try to to hasten the death of all of the three men who were crucified together, the two criminals with Jesus and Jesus himself. They wanted this done before the end of the Sabbath on Passover. So this was important to the Jews, and the Jews, and also the Romans. Pontius Pilate was a weak leader, and he was also trying to keep order in the city, and was trying to appease the Jews. He did not want to put Jesus to death, as we see from the gospel accounts. It's the Jews who wanted Jesus dead, and they wanted him off the cross. They wanted the crosses empty before sundown on the day of Passover. And so,
But this is the part that doesn't seem to make sense to me. Pontius Pilate would not have done this because the Jews said so. Like, he's not going to deviate the entire legal system because the Jews asked. He
well,
doesn't
baby,
care.
he ordered the scourging and crucifixion of Jesus at the behest of the Jews, because the Jews were worried about the uprising, the crowd following after Jesus. Pontius Pilate was worried about the uprising of the Jews because that would reflect badly upon his leadership as a Roman procurator, and he was worried about how he would appear to Rome. So Jews had their interests, and Pilate had his interests also. That's why he gave in to their demands to have Jesus, whom he declared innocent 3 times or twice. I find no fault in him. Why he agreed to have this man with whom he found no fault put to death to appease the Jews. And then if that's the case, then it's also likely that he appeased the Jews by allowing the dead people to be taken off the cross at the eve of Passover.
Well, that seems to be like the contradiction here, because if Pontius Pilate cares about what Rome thinks about him, he's not going to break the legal system that all of Rome uses. He's not going to be like, we're going to give special exceptions and take these bodies down from the crucifixion. That is literally the opposite of anything he would ever do, because that does seem like special treatment, and that would make Rome question him. Crucifying a Jew, no one cares about that. Like, they do that all the time. Rome would be totally fine with that. Taking him off, giving him a tomb, giving him guards, giving this artificial authority to his story, that is something Rome would not like. They would be very upset with this.
Rome did not give Jesus a tomb. That was a Pharisee, a counselor of the Pharisees, Joseph of Arimathea, whose tomb it was. And he's the one who offered his tomb for the burial of Jesus. So all that could be done before sundown on Passover day. Now,
but that's
let's
just
go
the
back
problem. The problem here is that Rome wouldn't like that. Rome wouldn't like you allowing the body to be given special treatment here. The whole point of crucifixion is to not do that. That's why you do it, is to not give them special treatment. It's
Well,
a
but
generic killing.
I just explained why Rome would do that. It's because Rome had no interest in the death of Jesus whatsoever. It is that the Jews were trying to make him a rival to Caesar as a king, and Jesus said, "Yes, I am a king, but not of this world," and that he never answered Pilate directly about his claim to kingship, other than to say, "You have said it," and he also confirmed that he did not deny that he was at least a king of another kingdom, but not a threat to earthly power. It is, but at the same time, let's assume that it was very much on the minds of the Jews to bury literally anything having to do with Jesus. They did not want anybody to follow Jesus. They put him to death because they were worried. He said, "Unless we do something about this man," Caiaphas said, "the whole world will follow him." And so they were interested then in finding an occasion to put Jesus to death, and they couldn't do it, at least on Palm Sunday, because the whole world was then following him, and they looked for an opportunity then provided by Judas Iscariot, who would betray him and turn him over to the Pharisees. They wanted the cult of Jesus to be put down. They wanted to reassert their authority because Jesus was a direct threat, they perceived, to their authority as religious leaders. Therefore, let's move aside from focusing on Rome and let's focus on the Jews. Wouldn't it behoove the Jews to put to death this whole idea of Jesus and the followers of Jesus as a Messiah figure? Wouldn't it behoove them to simply produce the body of Jesus? If they produced the body of Jesus, then that would shut everything down. But they have not produced the body of Jesus. There was an empty tomb. It remains empty to this day. Jesus appeared the day of the resurrection. He appeared to his 11 disciples. He appeared to 2 on the road to Emmaus. He demonstrated that he was alive physically by eating in their presence, by letting them handle his hands and his feet. And later the next week, he invited the doubting Thomas, who was not present with the apostles on the night of the resurrection. He invited him to actually touch his hands, touch his feet, put his hands in his side. He ate fish in their presence, but meanwhile, he also passed through doors. So Jesus had a different nature. He was now human, but a glorified human. He had certain human characteristics as any human would have, but he had certain sublime characteristics as the resurrection body will have. But he demonstrated to, as St. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 15, he demonstrated over a period of 40 days, I think the count was 543 appearances to others. At one time, Paul says he appeared to 500 people at one time, and Paul says, and most of those are still alive at the time that he wrote, at the time that he gave a sermon that Luke recorded in Acts, at the time of the sermon in 2 Corinthians 15. So we know that Jesus, after his resurrection, bodily appeared to people who doubted his resurrection. St. Thomas, the apostle Thomas, doubted the resurrection. He said, "Unless I put my fingers in the palms of his hands and put my hand in his side, I will not believe." He refused to believe, and so Jesus appeared to him separately or with the 11 and invited him to do that very thing, to test whether Jesus was in fact alive. And we also see later, when the apostles went to the Sea of Galilee, Jesus appeared to them there. The apostles were out, several of the apostles were out fishing, and they noticed a figure on the beach with a charcoal fire cooking some fish. And so that figure on the beach called to them, and it was Jesus. They didn't recognize him at first. And then he told them to let down their nets on the other side of the boat. And they brought, and at that time, John said to Peter, "It's the Lord." Peter stripped off his garments, swam across the way from the boat to the beach, and fell at Jesus' feet because he had betrayed him 3 times. Meanwhile, the apostles brought in a net full of 153 fish, an interesting detail, laid it out on the beach, and then Jesus met with them and then separately forgave Peter for his 3 betrayals. So we see various post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. These aren't just ghosts. They aren't hallucinations, because you can't have a hallucination appearing to 500 people at one time. You cannot have these different people experiencing the physical Jesus on these different occasions. And so Jesus made it clear by many things that he did during that time period that he was in fact alive and risen from the dead, as he had said. If the Jews wanted to rebut this, all they had to do is produce the body. They never produced the body. The Romans didn't produce the body. The Jews didn't produce the body. And we have then to look not only at these physical appearances, but the transformation of the apostles, who were dejected, defeated, and then went on in the very same city where Jesus was put to death. They went on literally 40 days later and preached the gospel of Jesus, talking about how the Jews put him to death and how he was raised. And they performed extraordinary miracles. 3,000 were converted that first day, actually 50 days after the death of Jesus, 50 days after his resurrection. And the apostles were converted, and they preached the resurrection of Jesus, and no one defected from that. They all died martyrs' deaths, except for John, who died of old age, and they died professing the truth that what they're preaching was the good news, not of the crucifixion, but the good news of the resurrection. The resurrection was crucial to the foundation of Christianity.
Well, yeah, but how is this different from literally any other religion? All of the religion people believe in their religion. That's true. And they all believe that their stories are true. And they all have some kind of a vision. That's one of the major theories of the origin of religion, was schizophrenics who had visions, and they came up with these ideas. But like nothing in the resurrection story that you said seems to in any way be evidence. Like, I want to show you a video real quick. Share screen. Share audio. Share.
None of the authors were eyewitnesses. Paul himself indicates that he was not an eyewitness, and none of the gospel writers was an eyewitness. People, of course, call the gospel books Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, they call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because we don't know who wrote these books, and there's no point calling them Sam, Fred, Jerry, and Harry. I mean, they're written by people we don't know who they were written by. They are anonymous. You might not think so because they have the title, The Gospel According to Matthew. Whoever put that title on it was an editor later. The original books are all anonymous, written in the third person. Moreover, the followers of Jesus were Aramaic-speaking peasants from Galilee, lower-class men who were not educated. In fact, Peter and John in Acts chapter 4, verse 13, are literally said to be illiterate. They couldn't read and write. Of course not. They were fishermen. They didn't go to school. The vast majority of people in the ancient world never learned to read, let alone write. And their native language was Aramaic. These books are written in Greek by highly educated, rhetorically trained writers who are skilled in Greek composition. Probably not disciples, and don't claim to be disciples. Where did these authors get their stories from? Well, if they were not disciples of Jesus, they must have heard the stories from somebody. Who heard the stories from somebody, who heard the stories from somebody, who heard them from somebody. Stories about Jesus, including his resurrection, had been in circulation year after year after year from the time that his disciples knew that he got killed and believed he got raised from the dead. They told stories to convert people. They improved the story sometimes. They changed the story sometimes. The stories got modified in the process of transmission over the course of decades before anybody wrote the stories down. These stories are based on oral reports that have been in circulation for decades. What happens to oral reports in circulation year after year, decade after decade? They get changed. What evidence do we have that the stories about Jesus' death and resurrection got changed? You can read the stories yourself. Simply read Mark's account of Jesus' death and then read John's account of Jesus' death and make a list of everything that happens in both and compare your lists. You will find that there are stunning differences. In fact, there are discrepancies. Let me give you just a list of very quick examples. What day did Jesus die on? That's a simple question. And luckily, we're told in both Mark and John. In Mark's gospel, we're told that Jesus died the day after the Passover meal was eaten in Jerusalem. John tells us explicitly, chapter 19, verse 14, that Jesus died the day before the Passover meal was eaten, on the day of preparation for the Passover. That's different. He couldn't die both days. What about the time? According to Mark, he died at 9 in the morning. According to John, he wasn't condemned to death until afternoon. John 19:14. These are accounts that differ from one another. Did Jesus carry his cross the entire way to Golgotha, or did Simon of Cyrene carry it? It depends which gospel you read. Did both robbers mock Jesus, or did only one of them mock him and the other come to his defense? It depends which gospel you read. Did the curtain in the temple rip in half before Jesus died, or was it after he died? It depends which gospel you read. I can give you the references for all of these if you need me to, or you can look them up yourself. I'm not making these up. Those are just differences about Jesus' death. What about differences in the accounts of his resurrection? Well, who went to the tomb on the third day? Did Mary Magdalene go alone, or did Mary go with other women? Depends which gospel you read. If with other women, how many of them were there? What were their names? And which ones were they? Depends which gospels you read. Was the stone rolled away before the women got to the tomb or not? What did they see in the tomb? Did they see a man? Did they see two men? Or did they see an angel? Depends which gospel you read. What were they told to tell the disciples? Were the disciples supposed to stay in Jerusalem to see Jesus, or were they supposed to go to Galilee? Depends which gospel you read. Did the women tell anybody, or were they silent about it? Depends which gospel you read. Did the disciples ever leave Jerusalem? Or did they never leave, or did they leave and go to Galilee? Depends which gospel you read. My conclusion, these are not reliable historical accounts. There are too many discrepancies. The accounts are based on oral traditions that have been in circulation for decades. Year after year, Christians tried to convert others by telling them stories to convince them that Jesus was raised from the dead, and they changed their stories while trying to convince people. These authors were not eyewitnesses. They're Greek-speaking Christians living many years after the fact. They're telling stories that Christians have been telling all these years. There was nobody there taking notes. Some of the stories were invented, many were changed. For this reason, these accounts are not as useful as historians would like as historical sources. What I've given you so far is really just kind of child's play compared to the real problem of why historians cannot prove the resurrection. And this is what I want to spend my last 3.5 minutes on, the real problem. Mike and I agree that what historians try to do is establish what most probably happened in the past. That is the task of history. You can't prove the past. You can only give evidence for the past. And some evidence is more certain than other evidence. All the historian can do is show most probably what happened. What are miracles? Miracles, by definition, are the least probable occurrence of an event. If a miracle was not least probable, it wouldn't be a miracle. If somebody could walk across the lukewarm water in your swimming pool, that would be a miracle. If the water was frozen, it would not be a miracle. But if it's lukewarm, I can tell you, none of you here could do it, and nobody in this world could do it. That's 6 billion people, so what are the chances of one person being able to do it? It would defy the way nature naturally works. I'm not saying that there are natural laws that are written down someplace that you can't break or you get in big trouble. Scientists today don't talk about natural laws, but scientists do talk about highly predictable ways that this world works. And one of the ways it works is that if you are a sentient human being trying to walk across the lukewarm water in your swimming pool, you won't be able to do it. What if somebody could do it? What would be the chances? The chances would be infinitesimally remote that anybody could do it. Well, what if somebody could? Okay, let's say somebody could. The chances of them being able to do it are infinitesimally remote. Can you prove that this person probably did it? No, you can't prove it, because you can't repeat the experiment of the past to show he did it. That's the problem with history. It's not like the natural sciences. The natural sciences work by repeated demonstration. And so, for example, if I wanted to show you that bars of iron will sink in that swimming pool and bars of ivory soap will float, all I need to do is to get 100 bars of both and start chucking them in. I'll chuck in 100 bars of iron, they'll sink every time. I'll chuck in the soap, they'll float every time. That gives us a predicted probability of what will happen the 101st time. That's how sciences work, by repeated experimentation. Historians don't have that luxury. Historians can only establish on the basis of surviving evidence what probably happened in the past, and by definition, miracles are the least probable occurrence, or else they're not a miracle. This creates the dilemma for the historian, and is the reason why historians cannot prove Jesus was raised from the dead. Historians, by the very nature, establish what most probably happened in the past, but a miracle, by its definition, is the least probable occurrence in the past. The least probable occurrence cannot be most probable. This is the problem with the resurrection. Even if it happened, it defies imagination and cannot be accepted as a historically proven event. Belief in the resurrection. If you believe in the resurrection, it is for theological reasons. The resurrection is a theological assertion about what God did to Jesus. It is not, and it cannot be, based on historical proof. Thank you.
So, we're stop sharing. Stop sharing. There we go. So,
Mr. Ehrman, yes, Dr. Bart Ehrman.
Well, so the question here is, like, if we're trying to assess what's the best explanation of the Gospels, that seems to be a very good explanation. Like all the evidence seems to support Bart's interpretation there, which is the consensus among historians. That's what the experts in the field think is the best explanation. And you seem to be be presenting a different explanation that does seem inherently to be less plausible. Is it possible? Sure. I don't think miracles are impossible. I think it's possible there's a God. It's possible that he did all these things, but is that a plausible explanation? And I'd say no, for the exact same reason I don't accept any of the other religions. Like, is it possible Romulus and Remus were raised by wolves and founded Rome? Sure. Is it possible that Zeus exists? Sure. But the most plausible explanation is that those were stories made up by men and they don't actually correspond to reality. And we have very good reasons to think that that is the case for the Bible, as well as every other one of these miracle cases in historical documents.
All right. Well, we'll divert on the topic of miracles. There are various ways to look at the topic of miracles, whether miracles, first of all, we need a proper definition of miracles, and then we need to decide, have miracles actually occurred? And we also have to decide whether it's possible for miracles to occur. But I don't want to divert on that right now. We can talk about that. There may be a topic for another time, but I do want to go back to the central issue here, and that is what happened to Jesus. And so we agreed earlier that Jesus either died as a result of the crucifixion or he did not die as a result of the crucifixion. Now, it's clear he was crucified, and the accounts indicate, the historical accounts indicate that Jesus did die. And even you say that if Romans put him to death, then he died. He was not taken down in some unconscious state and then came to life again later. There's very little argument or support for the idea that this man who was treated so horribly on the cross could have survived that. And then the question is, well, then what happened to him after that? You know, if his disciples were looking for him and he swooned and he came and he resuscitated and came back to life, then what happened? I think it's safe to say he in fact died.
Yeah, I believe that is the historical consensus, that he
Yes.
did die. He was crucified. I don't think there's a swoon theory. It's more just
Right.
he died.
No, so we can disregard the swoon theory. Thank you. So then Jesus died. Then the alternatives are Jesus rose or Jesus did not rise. Right? Those are the...
Sure.
Oh, all right. So if Jesus died and Jesus rose, then we have Christianity, correct?
Well, we'd have Christianity either way. There's lots of religions that started based on resurrections that I assume you would grant didn't happen, like Dionysus and all the different other kinds of gods that were dying and rising gods, and they didn't happen. Santi Sai Baba was a resurrection of a different guy. I'm assuming you don't think that happened. So there's lots of religions based on resurrections that didn't happen, so that whether or not the resurrection happened, you'd still have Christianity either way.
Actually, you don't. You don't have Christianity, because then you would have a non-miraculous religion. Christianity is founded on the resurrection of Jesus. If you don't have a resurrection, you don't have Christianity. Even Paul says that in 2 Corinthians 15. He said, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then we are preaching a false gospel. We are misrepresenting things. Our hope is in vain. And then nothing that we've learned or talked about Jesus was true, because Jesus
I just want to clarify. So I think that whether or not the resurrection happened, you'd still have the religion of Christianity today. It would just be false. So I agree that Christianity would be false if the resurrection didn't happen, but the religion would still exist. You'd still have billions of Christians around the world, regardless.
If Christianity preaches that Jesus rose and Jesus did not in fact rise, then Christianity is a lie, and we should believe something else.
Sure.
Right? Okay. Yeah. All right. So let's assume then that Jesus died and that Jesus did not rise. Then we have to figure out, well, then what happened? I mean, how did this story circulate? So there's only 4 explanations there. If Jesus died and Jesus did not rise, then the apostles were deceived by a hallucination. That's one possibility, that the apostles hallucinated, that you yourself brought out the bereavement idea, that their minds were so damaged by the death of the one they followed that they hallucinated their belief that Jesus rose from the dead. The other explanation is that if Jesus died and Jesus did not rise from the dead, then the apostles were making a myth. They were mythologists. The other possibility is that if Jesus died and Jesus did not rise from the dead, then the apostles were deceivers, and they were under some kind of a conspiracy theory that they were going to cook up an idea that Jesus, they were going to conspire amongst themselves and by a lie and say that Jesus did not rise from the dead. I'm sorry, that Jesus did rise from the dead when he did not. So the explanations are, if Jesus died and Jesus rose, then that is the central tenet of Christianity. And if that did not happen, then we don't have Christianity. But if Jesus died and Jesus did not rise, then the apostles were either hallucinating, or they were circulating a myth, or they were liars cooking up a conspiracy to deceive the world.
Or it was embellished later. But yeah, that's the same.
Well,
of
that
all
would be the
religions.
myth. That'd be the myth idea. It was embellished later.
Okay, so but yeah, that's the same of literally every religion ever has the exact same criterion. Either people were making stuff up, they were deluded, it became embellished over time, or those are really the three most common options. So that's true of all religions. Yes.
Correct. All right. So the question was, did the apostles hallucinate the resurrection of Jesus? Because they say that he rose from the dead, and the gospel writers say he rose from the dead, and they got this from the apostles. And so were the apostles collectively, or over this period of time, hallucinating when they saw a figure that they thought was Jesus?
Yes.
Pardon me?
Yes, my answer would be yes. We have
So,
very good evidence of that.
If the accounts are that 11 apostles, and then later, 10 apostles at one time, 2 at one time, and then the 11, including Thomas, over a period of 1 week, all experienced being in the presence of Jesus, who ate with them and allowed them to touch him. That these overall 12 people over this 1 week period having these different encounters with Jesus, they were all hallucinating when they saw it.
Yeah, that's common.
That's how hallucinations work. Hallucinations.
It's common. It's common for bereavement delusions. Bereavement delusions, families can have them.
So are you saying then that 11 people would have this external event that they would be a hallucination? Aren't hallucinations internal events that aren't hallucinations? Have you ever seen can you point me to an example where multiple people over a period of time would have hallucinated the same thing?
It's called. There's many different instances of that. The most common folie à deux is a specific kind of an event where there's two identical hallucinations of two different people, and there's folie à trois, whatever the French word for three is. It's very well documented. This is from the NCBI medical doc, and folie à deux is a very common thing to happen. Another is communal reinforcement. Communal reinforcement is where groups of people are together. They see an event they can't explain. Somebody explains it as something, ghosts, Wiccan, spirits, whatever. Then everybody's like, oh, it was a ghost and spirit. They agree on it, and so they share the hallucination in that way. So communal reinforcement is a common one. That's like what happened at the one where they saw the sun move in Mexico, where there's thousands of people. They all saw the sun move.
That was in Fatima, Portugal, in 1917, seen by 70,000 people, mostly who were there to mock the seers who were reporting on the apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Yeah, community reinforcement. So that's another common phenomenon. Same thing we can see with Santi Sai Baba, and he did miracles in front of tens of thousands of people. Same thing. He just did regular stuff, and people interpret it as miracles. So yes, we see this all the time. It's very common. None of that is very spectacular whatsoever. We know about all these things in psychology as being common features of every religion all over the world.
I see. So you were saying then that when St. Paul says that 500 people saw the resurrected Jesus at one time, that this was a common hallucination, and if 500 people reported on that and who were still alive at the time of Paul's writings, who could negate what Paul said, nevertheless, it had to be a hallucination, because in your scheme, there's no other explanation. It cannot be real. It had to be a hallucination.
No, it could definitely have been real. It's just not the best explanation. The best explanation is that exactly what they're saying is a very common thing we see all over the world all the time. There are thousands and thousands of accounts of large groups of people experiencing a miracle, like the Fatima example, like the Santi Sai Baba example, like the UFO example, the Roswell example. These happen all the time. These are not even rare that 500 people will see what they think is some kind of a supernatural event and report it with the same better eyewitness testimonies than what's in the Bible. Like, we have thousands of people literally giving their eyewitness testimony of events that they saw, and it's still not evidence of a miracle. It's possibly a miracle. Is that likely? No, it's not the best explanation here. So yes, we see all kinds of 500 people. I think it says 500 men, so there's probably would have been more. But yeah, we see that all the time, that large groups of people see something they can't explain, and through communal reinforcement, they attribute that to some specific ideology. And that's a very common thing throughout human history. That's many religions have that. Hinduism has more.
But this is interesting in that hallucinations are usually private events. They usually are brief. But here we see this hallucination appearances of Jesus happening to many people under different circumstances over a period of 40 days. And you're saying, oh, every single one of those appearances must be a hallucination. None of them could be a resurrected man.
Well, no, it could be, but if we see a cup fall over, like, it could have been a leprechaun that knocked over the cup, but it was most likely the wind. The wind is the better explanation. So if we know of some phenomenon that is extremely common, that happens all over the world, and we have tons and tons and tons of evidence for it, like the wind, and we see a cup fall over, it's possible that it was a leprechaun. But the better explanation was it was the wind, because we know of a natural phenomenon that causes that and could have explained everything we just saw. So it's better to say it was probably the wind here. And so communal reinforcement is exactly this. It is exactly large groups of people experience something they don't understand. Someone in the group attributes it to an ideology, and then the entire community says, it must have been that thing. Aliens, Wiccan, spirits, a dead grandma. There are tons and tons of these cases in history. Santi Sai Baba is a great one. Different kinds of ghosts are a great one. UFOs are a great one. There's tons of these. So we know this happens all the time in the human mind. It's a thing that the mind does that explains unknowns, and it's extremely common. And so this is a better explanation of that event than anything.
So you think that the hallucination theory is a better explanation of an event than people actually conversing with the hallucination, eating with him, talking to him, touching him, seeing him in different circumstances at different times. If you're going to find the most logical explanation, isn't it quite logical to say that hallucinations don't ordinarily occur like this, but this is what occurs when you meet a person. You meet a person and you have a conversation with him, you talk with him, you touch him, you know that this person is occupying space, and that you're seeing over a period of time, and then it's seen by many people at one time, basically 543 people over a period of 40 days. That explanation, which seems to be the simplest explanation, like your explanation of wind knocking over a cup, the simplest explanation here is this really was a human being they were talking to.
Yeah, so the two things are, the one is the 500 people, so that was communal reinforcement, cut and dry. We have thousands of examples of that. The touching of the body, that's bereavement delusion. Again, we have thousands of examples of that. 30 to 60% of elderly people experience bereavement delusion, where they can see, hear, touch their dead loved one. Again, extremely common. It's both of those things. I wouldn't say, I don't think the 500 saw and touched him. I think they just had a communal reinforcement of some event in the sky they couldn't explain, and that was probably why they all saw him. And then the apostles were bereavement delusions, where they could see, hear, and touch, just like the other bereavement delusions of elderly people, which are experienced by 30 to 60% of all elderly people when they lose a loved one. So yes, both of those things are extremely common, easy to explain events that we have thousands of examples of empirical things that do exactly all of those here in the world. Like seeing a cup fall over, wind did it. There's tons and tons of evidence of all of that happening. And none of that is in any way special outside of the realm of human psychology.
So if these apostles, if all these people were hallucinating, then where in fact was the body of Jesus? If they were not encountering Jesus, then where was he?
Mass grave with all the other bodies.
That seems not to have been the case. In fact, if that's the case, if the apostles were so decimated, but so bereaved that they were hallucinating the existence of Jesus, and therefore, and then 50 days later, they go out and change the world in the very city where he was put to death, right in the face of the Pharisees, right in the face of Rome, and they're preaching the resurrected Jesus, and they're going to their deaths because of this. Then how easy would it have been for the Jews to find that mass grave? They wouldn't have been buried. That mass grave where Jesus was put 50 days earlier, and produce the broken, bloody body of Jesus, to put down this uprising amongst the Jews, to put down this idea of a group now that's a threat to Rome. Why not just produce the body?
Well, because it would be impossible. Like it would be extremely hard to sift through hundreds of dead bodies that have been decaying and torn apart by birds and things to identify the Jesus one. Like that would be really hard. Pretty much impossible. Even if they presented a body, the apostles would be like, nope, that's not him. Nope. Because that happens all the time too. Like people think someone rose from the dead. You present their body like, nope, it's just a doppelganger. That's also a thing.
We're talking though a span of less than 2 months. This body would have been in a grave, dumped outside of the dumped near where the crucifixions occurred. In fact, later on, hundreds of years later, that's when Constantine's mother, Saint Helena, went to go look for the very cross of Jesus amongst the crosses that were there, and she was able to, through a miracle, which of course you're going to deny, located the cross that was the cross of Jesus. But if we're talking 50 days after he was put to death, that body could have easily been identified, and the Jews or the Romans could have produced it and put down all this talk about a Messiah, talk about a leader of the Jews, the king of the Jews, as Pontius Pilate had labeled him over the cross. They could have just simply produced it, but they didn't.
Well, so first concern is that 50 days after death, you can't identify the body unless you've treated it with formaldehyde, because like it's the internal organs decay within 3 days, start to decay. 5 days, the body starts to bloat and like becomes expanded, so that's going to make it harder to identify it significantly. 10 days, it's when the skin turns green and the blood turns green, so that completely changes the way you look. Several weeks after, like this is like 14 days, the nails and teeth fall out, so that can't be identified anymore. A month after, the body starts to liquefy, so no physical features identifiable anymore because the entire shape of the body has changed, been bloated and liquefied. So that's 1 month, that's 30 days, half of the time. And this is not outside being picked away by rats and birds and stepped on and little bugs that eat away, like, so there's no way, if it's been out in the like just public ground for 2 months, no one would be able to identify it unless you had like DNA testing. It would be impossible.
Well, let me interrupt you there, since we're talking about probabilities. So the disciples believed that Jesus was the Son of God, the Savior of the world. They knew that Jesus had predicted, that Jesus had performed miracles in their midst, that he preached like no one else had ever preached. He predicted that he would be crucified. He predicted he would rise from the dead. Assuming your argument that the Romans put him to death, he remained on the cross, still his devotees, his mother, would know where they put his body afterwards. Let's assume that your argument that the Romans left him on the cross and that he was taken down from the cross, his mother and his disciples would certainly have kept watch for that. They would not have just abandoned him. They would know that he was there, and they would have taken steps to preserve the body, like they took the steps to preserve the body of Joseph when he was taken to Egypt in the book of Genesis. They would have taken the steps to preserve the other great saints. They knew where Abraham was buried. They knew where Isaac was buried. They knew where the early patriarchs were buried. They knew all of these things. The Jews knew where their holy ones were. You can even, and so it's improbable. It's it is more improbable that they would not understand and know where the body of Jesus was, given who he was to them, given who he was to his mother. But Mary, his mother, was alive. She was at the foot of the cross. She would have noted all these things. And even the apostle John, who was at the foot of the cross, he would have noted all these things. They would have noted what happened to the body of Jesus. And so you're assuming that Jesus was put to death by the Romans and he was abandoned, and no one ever thought of him ever after that, because he was put in a mass grave and became just congealed matter within 30 days. That is so far-fetched. And if you want to keep with Jewish customs, you want to keep with the customs of Jesus and his followers, it is impossible that they would not have known exactly where the body of Jesus was after his death.
Well, I'm not following. So when Romans took bodies off crosses, it wasn't like they're just going to take one off. They take bunches off, they put them on a cart, they dump the entire cart in. This is at the point where they're already bloated and green and unverifiable, and their teeth have fallen out because they've been up there for normally several weeks. So if you take a bunch of dead bodies that are already decomposing, that you already can't identify, put them in a box, shake them up, and then dump them in a big pit, there's no way that Mary could have identified Jesus out of the 50 dead bodies there that they just dumped from the one cart. Even if she had the right cart, because she wasn't going to be sitting there 24/7 over this 2-week period. And then we're going to announce, we're going to take the body down, everybody come watch. It's just like they took it down at one time. Possibly one of his followers were just sitting there watching. Oh, they're taking the body down. They put it in a large cart, and then they'd have to try to remember which part of the cart it was in. When they carted it off several miles to the mass grave, they'd have to follow them on foot rather than horseback with the Romans, and then recall exactly the location where the body was, see exactly, have to be within a 20-foot radius to see where they dumped the body, and then keep their eye on it, like somebody playing those little cup games where we put the ball in the cup and then move it around and remember which one was Jesus, because they couldn't have identified it. It's completely implausible that they actually knew which one was Jesus at this point. No way.
You bring up an interesting point, since you know a lot about Roman customs with respect to crucifixion, how long the bodies stay on the cross and all this. How long would a body stay on the cross before the Romans took it down?
It depends. It changed. There wasn't a standard.
No, but I mean, would it have stayed up there for several days?
Sure.
Would it have stayed up there for a week?
Usually more.
Okay. So assuming you're taking your theory that Jesus died as a common criminal, that the Romans had no special interest in seeing him buried, they had no special interest in appeasing the Jews who wanted to take down the bodies at the close of the day on Passover, they simply left him there. They left him there. Of course, Mary would have known which cross was his because they left him there. John would have known which cross was his because they left him there. All the apostles who loved and followed Jesus would have known which cross was his because they left him there. He was on full public display for at least a week. And therefore, when they saw Jesus the very third day after his crucifixion, the day when he said he would rise from the dead, Resurrection Sunday, Easter Sunday, they saw this man, and but the man that was standing before them, they could have easily walked out to, not that far away because they were still in Jerusalem, to say, nope, there's his cross, he's still there. That seems ridiculous, because you're saying the Romans would have left him there and he would have been there until he fell apart. Meanwhile, 3 days later, he's appearing to the apostles who were not expecting to see him alive. He presents himself alive, and then how easily negatable that would have been for people to just simply say, no, this is a hallucination, because there he is right over there on the hill on his cross, rotting with the other two thieves.
Yeah, so like I said, the time when Romans take it down changes. It's not always the same, but at any point when they do take it down, there's no way to identify the body at this point. You're not going to see it. You're not going to be able to say it's that one, and then follow them to the location and then identify where the body is in the grave. That's not plausible at any point when they take it down.
Well, so what's not plausible is your rejection of the hallucination. Your rejection of the resurrection account, saying that the apostles were either hallucinating when they saw him, or they knew that Jesus was still on the cross, or in the tomb, that Jesus was still there, and they were therefore representing him to be alive when he was in fact dead, and therefore they were liars. They were either hallucinating or they were liars. They either were deceived in thinking that the man that was standing before them was in fact a live human being, the resurrected Jesus of Nazareth, or they knew he was dead and they're making up a story about him, yet telling all the world that he in fact rose from the dead, and therefore they were liars. Or they were making up a myth, and they were making up this myth about the resurrection of Jesus, and they were making it up within 60 days of the date of his death, when the Jews and the Romans could have said, nope, he is in a common grave. We saw him in the grave. We took him down. We threw him in the grave. He fell apart. His body was here. It was on the cross, but he's gone. And the Jews could have rebutted that. The Romans could have rebutted it. But instead, in the very city where Jesus was put to death under Pontius Pilate and the Jewish leaders, they said, no, this man rose from the dead. And there was not time here to make a myth. There was not time to make any of this stuff up. And the stories of Jesus rising from the dead were not some fanciful mythical story. Bart Ehrman is incorrect. The whole idea that this myth could have been created while the people who had written about Jesus were still alive within 30 to 60 years after his death, you're not going to have a myth develop like this. And these stories.
I'm not sure what you mean, because it literally happens all over the world all the time. Like they're saying that myths won't happen in short periods. They literally happen all over the world.
You're fond of these general statements. You're just fond of these sweeping statements, and you're saying, "Oh, these things happen all over the world." People have bereavement issues. They have this common hallucination all over the world. It happens all the time. The one thing that you refuse to say as a good materialist, as someone who is going to be looking at the evidence, is that this evidence could have been at all true.
Well, it could be true. I've said that 3 or 4 times, but the evidence is sensing deceived spouse and remarkably common. Between 30 to 60% of elderly widowed people experience so-called bereavement hallucinations. It's extremely common. Do people see dead loved ones? Yes. After someone dies, it's normal to see, hear, or sense them. It is often because your mind has temporarily forgotten that they are died. Yes, it's extremely common. Like this is not just like single cases. This is like 60% of people everywhere in the world. This is not really rare. So I don't know what exactly you want more than that.
I'm just saying that and I'm sorry, let me get a little coffee. Doesn't help much, especially when it's cold. I think it is improbable that the hallucination theory holds up. I don't believe that these people could all be experiencing these external manifestations and encounters with Christ over this long period of time and have this be a hallucination. My argument there is that's not how hallucinations work, and that these were not hallucinating these different occasions, different encounters over a period of time with someone who acted as Jesus acted in their presence, appearing before them, conversing with them, talking to them, eating with them under these different circumstances. I'm also saying that the account that Jesus died and that Jesus rose from the dead was true, that the apostles were not deceived by hallucination. They were not making myths, that they were in fact telling with eyewitness accounts of what had happened, what they encountered. The eyewitness accounts do vary because they're eyewitnesses. There's no attempt at collusion of stories here. As Bart Ehrman said, there are differences in the accounts, there are differences in the details, and that's to be expected. But these details all agree, the accounts all agree that Jesus was not expected to be alive. The apostles did not believe he would rise from the dead. He, in fact, was buried, and there was an empty tomb, and his critics never produced a body. The apostles were not deceivers because that was completely against well, against their moral code. But not only that, but if they were deceivers, then they all prepared this story. They all concocted this story. They all stood by this story until they went to their deaths, and they all proclaimed this story to others around the world, especially in that area of Palestine and Rome and Roman territories. And therefore, if these men were deceivers, then they were great writers of a type of fiction that was not even known then. This type of very strange fictional account of this man Jesus, and they all went to their deaths professing it. And they also said that that basically their whole lives depended upon the truth of this story. I believe that at the end of the day, that it is true that Jesus died and that Jesus rose from the dead. I believe that Jesus rose from the dead because he had said he would rise from the dead. This had never before happened in the history of mankind, where you have this being that would be alive, that had these really supernatural capabilities, yet completely natural at the same time. The only reasonable
What do you mean by
account.
that part? Because to me, I see lots of cases of miracle workers who were supposedly supernatural, and there are at least a dozen cases of dying and rising gods prior to Jesus. I'm not sure what you mean when you say
Well,
this was the first case.
Well, Jesus presented himself as being completely human, but with certain capabilities. He could pass through walls. He could bilocate from one place to another. He could be with the disciples in Emmaus, and then at one moment, then be in the upper room with the disciples, presenting himself alive to them. He could be then. He was at the Sea of Galilee. Well, of course, he could be there. He could rise. He could rise into heaven in their presence before all these witnesses, as the witnesses observed him going into heaven 40 days after his resurrection, which is called the Ascension. And then, yet he could still eat with them and converse with them and appear to him in all respects as any other human being, except with these now glorified capabilities. And he also says, in fact, Paul says that our bodies at the end of time will have glorified bodies like his. He is the first fruits of all who fall asleep. We will all face death. We will all face a resurrection. You'll face a resurrection. I will too. And we are destined in eternity to live as a soul and a body, and our bodies will be resurrected bodies. Where they will be is a different question, but we all in this life have as our destiny not to die moldering in the grave, but at the end of time have a soul reunited with a body having the glorified state like Jesus's body. And so Jesus is the pioneer of all of us. In any event,
I have to go to the bathroom real quick. So could you mind answering the super chat? Can you see it at the bottom?
I'm sorry.
Can you see the super chat? Marty
Yeah, I see it.
asked, why are these
gospels believed to be true versus others are not considered canonical?
Yeah, I'll be back in 1 minute. I have to go to the bathroom really bad.
I do have an answer for that.
All right,
go ahead. And everybody else out there too.
All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. That's what happens when you drink like a gallon of coffee.
I know. I'm kind of running up against. I don't have infinite time today, so I am.
Okay.
All right, the question on the super chat is an excellent question. It just went away. But the idea, I think the question was, why do we consider the four canonical gospels, not other writings at the time or around that same time? So it is understood that the disciples must have left some writings, engaged as they were in giving lessons to and counseling believers who were geographically distanced. The gospel writers wrote down the accounts of Jesus to help spread the message about Jesus. There were many eyewitnesses who were still alive when these books were written, who could testify whether they came from their purported authors or not. Extra biblical testimony unanimously attributes the Gospels to their traditional authors. We can see testimony from the epistles of Barnabas, the epistle of Clement, the shepherd of Hermas, all the way up to Eusebius in 315. Theophilus, Hippolytus, and others all attribute the first four Gospels to their traditional authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there was even testimony from Christianity's opponents, Celsus, Porphyry, and Emperor Julian, who attributed the Gospels to their traditional authors. And getting to the super chat question, with a single exception, no apocryphal gospel is ever even quoted by any known author during the first 300 years after Christ. In fact, there is no evidence that any inauthentic gospel whatever existed in the first century in which all four gospels and Acts were written. And in fact, if you look at there were other biblical other writings purporting to be gospels. They were apocryphal gospels, and from the very earliest days of the church, there was in the apostolic fathers in the first century, the first 2 centuries, made efforts to accumulate the books that would be considered to be the canon of Scripture. So they weighed those that ought to be included and excluded others, but there was no consensus whatsoever to look at any of the other accounts of Jesus other than the traditional books written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You can look at the councils, the early church councils, the Council of Rome, Council of Florence, and ultimately the Council of Trent, to look at how the 27 books of the New Testament were assembled and why they were declared canonical and which books were excluded. I read this at one time about the process by which the church fathers started assembling the books, the letters of Paul, Peter, and Jude, and to make those, to determine if those ought to be considered canonical. So the Catholic Church declared which books of the New Testament then in circulation were canonical, but and frankly, I don't know all the reasoning process to reject various apocryphal gospels, but it was crucial to early Christianity to understand which books are useful for teaching faith and doctrine. So that's my.
All right. So we've been going for about an hour and a half. I want to be respectful of your time. Do you have time for one more question?
I have time for one more question, and I appreciate all of our exchange. This has been a lot of fun. But yes,
me too. I really appreciate you coming on. So Doug asked, was there anything in the New Testament that you think would be inaccurate or factually false?
No.
Okay. Quick answer.
No. And in fact, I will say this. I'm going to give a plug for my faith. I am, like I said, I'm a traditional Catholic, and I can confidently say there is nothing that the Catholic Church teaches in matter of faith and morals that is contradicted by Scripture, by either the explicit or implicit teachings of Scripture. And there is nothing in the explicit or implicit teaching of Scripture that contradicts anything that Catholics believe in matters of faith and morals. There is a complete harmony between divine revelation as we see it in Scripture and all the Catholic Church believes and teaches.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate your time, and it was enjoy
Thank you so
talking to
much.
you as always. And I will let
And
you
thanks
go.
to all the commentators, and thanks for being a respectful audience. But thank you very much. And listen, have a blessed Easter.
You too. You
I
too.
will conclude that Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again.
See you later. Talk to you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, guys, time for the after show. If you want to join the after show, let's go to, I just post this link. Let's try this one. If you guys want to join the chat, we do a Doug thing, the Doug thing. How do I don't know if I can copy that. Invite guests, copy. Social media, give me the YouTubes. The YouTubes, go here. Go here. Then I'll post join link in the chat. Pin message. Do the Doug. That's right. Do the Doug. Do the Doug. So if you guys want to join there, we can join Discord also if you want to join Discord. $5,000 Pine points to the first person who joins, because why not? Ah, somebody's in. Hello, Sumiru. How's it going? 5,000 Pine points to the first person who joins, because I can hear myself in your background, Sumiru.
I'm pretty good.
What's up? How is it going? What do you want to talk about? Any thoughts, questions, comments? Are you there? Can you hear me, Sumiru?
Give me a sec.
Hello, guys on the Discord. Let's do screen share.
Okay, it works now.
Yes, this is the after show, guys, in the Discord. All right, Sumiru, what's up?
Did you hear about the Ministry of Deliverance and that they're going to burn books tomorrow? Have you heard about that?
I have not heard about that. What is that? Which books? Are they going to burn the Quran? That would be interesting.
Well, apparently, yes. Anything that they consider not holy. So it's in Tennessee. It's this Church of Deliverance. There's a lot of on YouTube about this guy. I posted the link in religion here, and it's scary. They're in Tennessee, and they said that tomorrow they're doing this bonfire and they're burning books that are not holy. So that's fun.
I see nothing wrong with in burning books. I don't think that's inherently evil in any way.
For me, it's like burning ideas. I don't think we should burn ideas.
There are lots of ideas that we should burn.
Well, we talked about it, and I think it would probably burn that people have the ideas, but not the ideas themselves. What harm does a book have, apart from the fact that you can, I don't know, hit someone with it?
Well, I don't think that burning books is inherently bad, whether or not the book has any harm. So I think it's more just you have the right to buy a piece of paper, and you can burn that piece of paper if you would like to, as long as you're not burning other people's books. If you're burning other people's books, that's a problem. Like the destruction of the library in Greece, that was bad because it wasn't their books.
Sure, but with the last time I heard people burned books for religious or political reasons was the Nazi Germany, I think. And
That's
that wasn't very good.
Well, wasn't the last time, but the fact that the Nazis did it doesn't mean that it's inherently bad. Like Nazis also built helicopters. That doesn't mean building helicopters is inherently bad.
Of course,
So even though there's a negative connotation to burning books because the Nazis did it, it's just a hasty generalization to say that anybody who burns books is doing something bad.
I don't know. I consider burning books as a statement of any religion, and this is in particular this guy is head of this ministry in America, and he's saying that Freemasons and all the typical shit that they say, and this is why they're burning their books. Apparently, it says somewhere in the Bible that you should do that. He quotes I didn't check that passage in the Bible that God said to bring all the unholy books and burn them. So. Apparently that's something that their God told them to do. I just found it a bit scary that they're doing this. And he was very screaming that no one will stop him. The state of Tennessee can't stop them. They will do it. And that's it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see a problem. No matter who says it, it's still not evil. So even if Satan himself said burn books, it's still not evil to burn books. So I don't see a problem with that. As long as they're not harming anybody else, they're allowed to burn whatever books that they want to burn as long as they are their property. I see no problem with that.
Okay.
How are you guys doing? Any other topics we're talking about? Stuff to do?
Did you feel like this discussion that you had right now, because listening, did you feel like it was actually a discussion, more of the guy was preaching to you?
Sort of, definitely, because the long readings of the Bible definitely felt that way without a structured argument. It would have helped if it had like a structured argument of why that was beneficial in some way.
And this preaching always assumes that the story and everything underneath is true, right? So you
Begs the question.
Yeah, that's right. But they do it a lot, and like this very convoluted theories that they have that something happened, so it must be that. But there is no really. A lot of those stories don't have intentions behind them; they're just stories. He kept repeating them. I don't know. It was weird for me. Like being in a church.
I find it strange when people like this person would just cite things from the Bible, and just because it's written down, they think that it's true. I just don't get that. They're like trying to use the Bible as evidence, in my opinion, when it really has nothing backing it up. Somebody just decided to write these things down is about it.
Yeah, I would agree that you would need some independent evidence to believe why the stuff written down is true, and not just believe it because it's written down.
You always talk, or they talk about scholars who made some, they found something in the Bible that's true, and they based their debates on those scholars. I wonder, what do those scholars do? I think theology as a science is
It's not
it's not a
science.
science, right? So it's not scientific. It's not really real. It's pure, I don't know, mysticism, I think. So who are those scholars? Do you know any of them personally,
For
or
which?
at least have you heard?
For which claim?
Just any claim of, like the today there was a resurrection of Jesus, right?
Yeah.
So you quoted, I think, Bert Ehrman.
Yep.
So he's a scholar. He's someone I could listen to get this information. He read all those books and the books around the book. And
Yes, he is
those...
a professional historian who is an expert in New Testament and Bible scholarship and ancient history. So he is definitely a high-level academic in that field.
So someone I can trust that he knows his stuff, right?
Yep, for sure.
But your interlocutor didn't think that. He said Bert Ehrman is wrong.
Yes, he did say that.
He did say that, I think.
Yep, he did. He did say that. That was very interesting.
Provided nothing. He is wrong because he just said he's wrong.
Yeah.
Anyone can say anyone's wrong. So why is he wrong?
I think he did follow that up with like a statement. He's wrong, and then he said something about him trusting the Bible accounts and thinking that they are accurate historical reasons. So I think he gave a kind of reason why he thinks he was wrong, but he just didn't explicitly state it in the form of an argument.
I wonder if you can make if you can state why is Christianity and Jesus and God and all these things real without the Bible? Are there any reasons that people say, I believe in God and Bible doesn't matter?
I think that was our first, because this was our second conversation with Randall Grasso, and the first one was more of the philosophical arguments.
Mm-hmm.
And those are more the things you're asking for, the independent reasons to believe in a God outside of the Bible.
But it's still independent reasons to believe in the Bible. And then we go to the Bible, and out of the Bible come out the other ideas. And I'm thinking, no Bible. We don't use the Bible. We just use whatever the world is providing us today.
Yeah, that's where the philosophical arguments, like the cosmological, contingency, teleological, that's the point of those arguments, is that just give things independent of the Bible completely.
Mm-hmm. So these are the crazy ideas as far as I can understand.
I don't think they indicate a God, I think, but they are using facts independent of the Bible. That's true.
Do you think that Jesus existed as a person?
Yes. Yes, I believe that is the consensus in history.
I take it that you don't believe in a virgin birth and a resurrection, though, right?
There was a virgin birth, but it wasn't Jesus. It was the chair. The chair had a virgin birth.
Okay.
Right.
What evidence do you have to support the claim that chairs have ever been born?
They revealed themselves to me. It revealed itself to me in a private testimony. Also, you need to presuppose that chairs must be born in order to do logic. Therefore, if chairs weren't born, the reality wouldn't exist. So, you have to presuppose it. Transcendental argument for chairs.
So then where did the potatoes come in?
The potatoes are the word of the chair. The chair speaks through potatoes. It is how it imbues its message onto us. What does it mean to be born? In the beginning, there was the potato, and the chair born it into existence. Yahweh seems moral. Like, no, definitely not. Is this young chair propaganda? Yes.
Appreciate the talk again, guys.
Did he say anything about any scientific, I mean, like evolution, how long is the Earth, stuff like that? Was it mentioned? Did I miss it?
That was in the first conversation. So this one was specifically about the resurrection.
Is he a young Earth creationist?
I don't think so. FT super chat, $2. Thank you for the super chat. How much for you to have a formal debate with Zen MDD? Who is Zen MDD? Zen Shapiro on MDD? $50 is my normal fee. I don't know who. I think that's Zen Shapiro, but I'm not sure. If potatoes are the word, what are French fries? French fries are the Trinity. It's there, the Holy Spirit of the potato. Yeah, the new chat style is weird, Mr. Boss, but it's easier than the other one because Streamlabs stopped working. It had a bad update, and I had to use this one, and this one's it's easy. Buy TJump NFTs, yes. Thank you, Fayon. The chair is actually flat. Yeah, FT, if you can get Zen to set it up, that would be fine. Or get Zen to actually agree to it or something. Sigma any French fry praise, yes. Anybody else got any questions, comments? Want to join the Discord, chat, ask, do stuff, debate? I don't know. What does Pine Creek normally do? Somebody like insert a Pine Creek thing. Talk about Jesus. All right. If nobody's got any more questions or anything, I'm going to head off, get some food. Thanks for joining the after show, guys. Thank you for watching the stream, everybody who's in the YouTubes and the Twitches. See you guys later.
See ya.